morning. Welcome back to the Ground Zero Salem channel. It hasn't changed. I'm still Pat, your humble host. So, vacation's over. Going back to work tonight. And, just gonna be that whole re-entry thing, you know. But before, I fling myself back into the pit of financial servitude, I thought I'd shoot a video talking about 1996, and what a fun, fucked up year that was. We're talking about my senior year of high school. Certainly a coming-of-age era. First time I moved out from my parents' house, I was living with a bunch of ne'er-do-wells up in the Westcott Street area of Syracuse, New York. It was definitely a punk house. It was a shithole. The first week we were there, we had a housewarming party, at which point the entire inside of the house was spray painted by the attendees. Holes were kicked in the walls. I lived there for about 2.5 months before I decided it was bullshit. I was the only person that lived there that had a job. I worked at my local Price Chopper supermarket, bagging groceries. I was also trying to graduate high school. I think I moved in, I mean, it's very long ago now, but I believe it was sometime in April. It was the end of the school year for me, and I just scraped by and barely graduated. But I was trying to graduate high school and working like 30, 35 hours a week on top of it. It got to the point where so many people were crashing there, where a few kids from my high school ran away from home to live at my house. It was a total fucking no bueno. Several people I hung out with were pathological liars. And there's dudes who claimed like Waddy and the guys from Wrathchild America were members of their family. It was total, like, a couple of people were like just total like Napoleon Dynamite fucking weirdos. It was kind of a bad scene, but also really fun, you know. Drinking 40s and being stupid. At the end of that summer, I decided I was going to go travel, and by travel I was going to go hang out with my aunt in Cincinnati, and then with some friends of my parents in Rochester, New York, which is only an hour away. But I went and lived a few places for a couple of months at a shot. I think I spent a month in each town, so I got to have some interesting experiences and hang out and, you know, get into the music scene I was really into, which at the time was punk. You know, I was looking for anything that was incredibly punk, anything that involved studded leather jackets, mohawks. It was pretty superficial, but as young people tend to be, I was always looking for something new, something obscure. And if there's one thing that Syracuse didn't have, it was that kind of punk. So somewhere, I think it was like beginning of the summer of 96, I went down to Albany. I had a friend down there, and this is pre-widespread internet, you know, AOL dial-up era. And I went to my first punk show down there. I saw a couple of bands, of which I have the records right here. It's Abalienation band. They were from Binghamton, New York. They were a lot of fun. They were mainstays of upstate New York punk for a while. Binghamton had a really crazy, huge punk scene in the 90s. I never even went down to go to a show there, but they had a bunch of bands, including Anti-Product, these guys, the Martians, probably a couple of more, and they had some pretty big bands come through. House Rotten, who were a big deal at the time, whose record I'd probably be showing off if I still owned it. House Rotten came through there, I think. There was another one, a big Swedish D-beat band at the time, whose name is Disconto. Disconto had Daniel Eckeroff, who wrote Swedish Death Metal, the book on Bazillion Points, in the band. Just to mention that. But anyway, yeah. So Binghamton had a pretty happening scene for that sort of thing. Albany, it was pretty huge. It was kind of like a little New York City, like a cheaper place to live that a lot of people from New York moved up to. And they had a club called the QE2. So we found out about this 10 band all day punk fest kind of thing. Saw Abalienation, just lewd, crude, loud, kind of hardcore-ish punk stuff. This is a live at CBGB 7-inch. I think they put it out themselves on Runkpak Records. They used to do a song, cover "Let's Go to the Hop" and change it to "Let's Go Beat a Cop." Pretty silly, but there it is. Good soundboard, like, recording on this. CBGB's always actually did a pretty good job with live recordings. I think they just had soundboard stuff that you could pay for, but they were around forever. Abalienation played with everybody, played with death metal bands, played with pop punk bands. They were really the cornerstone of the scene there. I know it had two brothers, Mark and Mike, and I believe it was Mark moved to Toronto sometime in the late 90s or early 2000s. Another band that played was the Disenchanted. Disenchanted. This is a 7-inch that might have come out a little bit after 1996. It might have been 97 or something. This is the Other White Trash, but this is a 2-session recording. The side B is songs off their demo, which I had and wore out. Not quite pop punk, but definitely punk with a melodic edge. As time wore on, they got more complex and weird with their music. On one hand, it got more melodic and professional sounding, almost like on a Fat Wreck kind of tip, but the vocals got more abrasive, and the singer Kurt started sounding more and more like, kind of like Jake Filth from Filth or something like that. But they were always great, and I was a huge fanboy when they were around. I went to every show I possibly could that they played. I think I did book them in Syracuse once or twice. And I was in a band that year, joined up with a couple of kids in a band called Texas Shocker. And we were, like, kind of bad. Weird combination of, like, elements of Dead Kennedys and DRI, but also some weird integrity breakdowns for no reason. And I tried booking a show with Abalienation and these guys. I did not get these guys. The other dudes in my band did. The guys in Abalienation couldn't play. Their bassist didn't show up or something like that, so they just kind of hung out. But this band, All Else Failed, they were around for quite a while. This was definitely one of the few records of this style that I was into that year. This band was from Philly. They're pretty well known in certain circles. Metalcore is not really the word. They were kind of discordant, smashing, emotional but not emo, angry, noisy hardcore, for lack of a better term, descriptor, whatever. This only has 3 songs on it: Shoveler's Abandoned Ship and Pushover. If I remember correctly, it's got Fox and the Hound samples on it. I was just watching that with the family like yesterday, and I was like, oh yeah, this is from All Else Failed. But these guys were nuts at the time. They had 2 singers during this period. They stripped it down to 1 not too long after this came out. And the singers were just freaking out, leapfrogging off of each other's backs. You know, it was very, very intense. And there was like, they didn't give a fuck. There was like 15 people there at that show. So that was kind of what my life was. I was graduating high school. When I finished graduating, I was just hanging out, going to shows of bands I wasn't even really into at the time. Like, I never really appreciated Marauder until later. I would go and see them. The scene in my town was starting to fragment and kind of change. There was a lot of the bigger, kind of tougher New York hardcore bands that were coming around more and more, like Madball, 25 to Life, Marauder. And I would go to those shows and see those bands, and I would enjoy it live, but it wasn't really my thing at the time. Meanwhile, the local community center, the Westcott Community Center, would have more DIY punk shows and some really good hardcore and punk like DIY bands that I missed, unfortunately, like Monster X came around, Voorhees, stuff like that. And it was interesting because at that time, you know, there was the hardcore scene, which was huge, and everybody else who wasn't straight edge or necessarily into that scene, there were a lot of not so smart people that were like against the straight edge scene, and like I never really was down with that. I mean, I'd been claimed straight edge on and off up until about my senior year, where I started partying, and I just kind of like hung out with everybody. I had plenty of friends that were still involved in that scene, but it seemed like the people that would go to the shows at the Lost Horizon, the local club there, all kind of hung out together, and it was a lot of different styles of music. There was a band called 99 Cent Special that was, they were like an industrial band very similar to Skinny Puppy in a lot of ways musically, and they had kind of a weird S&M thing going on with a girl in the band going around and whipping people and stuff like that. But then there was a band called Canine Christ who were fucking great. You can look them up on YouTube. They have their demo up on YouTube, who sounded straight out of like late 80s New York, almost like Carnivore and SOD, that kind of thing. They were like angry Republican fucking crossover thrash. They all hung out with everybody. You know, there was like a goth band, there was some punk bands and stuff like that. So there's this kind of alternative to what was the big thing at the time in town, with slightly older folks, and those are the types of people that I kind of gravitated towards after I graduated. I also got into Oi that year. This is the CD that I originally had back then. Again, somehow it survived. Oi Greatest Hits, and I mean, this is just a laundry list of all the heavy hitters if you want to check out this kind of music. Sham 69, The Foreskins, The Partisans, Cockspar, Blitz, Red Alert, Last Resort, Peter and the Test Tube Babies, Cockney Rejects, The Business, Menace, Section 5, Infa Riot, The Oppressed, The Blood, The Gonads, The Violators, The Crack, The Ejected, and The Angelic Upstarts. Listen to this endlessly. Another thing that I listen to endlessly, let's shift a few things around here. The band that I was obsessed with the most that year was the Misfits. I'd heard them, you know, since I was in 8th grade or something like that, but I really became obsessed this year because this came out. This is the Misfits box set I'm holding in front of you. Got it as a birthday present for my 18th birthday when it came out, and it was amazing because it like I'd mentioned a few updates back, it's shown a huge light on this really mysterious, enigmatic band, which they were at the time. And this is right before they got back together with Michael Graves as the vocalist. But, you know, all the lyrics, most of everything that they recorded, there are a few things here and there that ended up on other reissues. But, you know, I listen to these guys endlessly. And, I mean, these discs are fucked up and scratched to shit. But, you know, just for the sake of sentimentality, I've held on to this forever. This originally came with like an enamel pin, which, God, haven't had that in a very, very long time. So I spun the crap out of this, and this was like my, you know, my holy grail, Ark of the Covenant. When I was living at that party house, like, people would play the CDs when I wasn't around and leave the CDs out of the cases, and I'd freak out and fucking yell at them. And at that time, like, the people I was living with and the people I was hanging out with, we were obsessed with this somewhat gone era of 80s hardcore and punk and stuff like that. And we didn't have a lot to go on. Like I mentioned a few updates back talking about Suburbia. There was no widespread internet where people kind of figure out how to dress or, you know, the bands to listen to just by a click of, you know, Google. So we watched Suburbia a lot, and we watched Another State of Mind a lot. This is the VHS. This is a documentary about Youth Brigade and Social Distortion going on tour in a school bus. The audio is kind of weird. I never really cared about it back then, but now I try to watch it, and I'm like, it's so loud in the background, I can't understand what some of the guys are saying. There's a whole weird cast of characters in this, and all real people. It's a documentary. This guy keeps dyeing his hair blue, and different colors like every stop of the tour for some reason. The tour manager / mechanic Monk, who's a complete lunatic. Mike Ness from Social Distortion's a real character in this. He's on something. He's drinking a lot, and he's probably on something else. Talking about his eye makeup and how it makes him look sympathetic and everything. It's a fun watch. There's the footage of all the shows that I found out later were from the Olympic Auditorium are incredible, as far as just like the masses of people swarming around in circles and stage diving off the stage. Again, when I was really into going to shows and dancing and going off, I definitely stole a lot of moves from that. I'm a little embarrassed to admit that in the Anthem video from Agnostic Front that used to be on Headbangers Ball all the time. The band that was supposed to headline that punk fest that we went down to in Albany, the Pist, they were supposed to headline. and did not end up playing because the show was more than $5. At least that's the story I was told. This came out on Elevator Music. It's called Ideas Are Bulletproof. Despite them dropping off the gig, I checked out their record anyway that year, and it's a bona fide classic of 90s punk. You could call it hardcore punk, certain, depending on your definition of the word. A lot of it kind of reminds me of raw or like Negative Approach or maybe DC hardcore stuff, but it's incredibly anthemic. All the lyrics really have a bite. I mean, the guy has got something to say. The singer, he's got like a big like axe to grind about a lot of things: hunting, violent hardcore kids, working class servitude, just questioning authority, that kind of stuff. Typical kind of punk stuff. But it's really well executed, and the songs are great. Pretty much everything they did is pretty damn good. But this LP is the best. And this came out, I think, right in 96 or 95, maybe, on Elevator Music. And I got the... this is a record I picked up years and years later, but I had the CD of this, I think. And this is Youth Brigade, Sound and Fury. Awesome, excellent early 80s, catchy, melodic, very Oi-influenced West Coast hardcore punk stuff. And like especially the melodies, the way they're layered in a lot of places are great. These guys were a three-piece. They were three brothers, the Stern brothers. And I actually just recently watched a documentary on YouTube about BYO Records, this record label that they ran, and how they built a lot of stuff, a lot of positive stuff, like in a very violent scene in the early 80s. So that was cool. Later on, BYO kind of... they were gone for a while, and they witnessed a resurgence in the late 90s and put out a lot of stuff, not all of which I'm a fan of, but had sort of a renaissance and were very successful. Like, they put out like the Rancid No Effect split. They did those split series and those Live in a Dive. No, Live in a Dive was fat. They put out all these split series with like Hot Water Music and Leatherface, and put out all these like really, really important records. I started buying records. I think this was maybe the genesis of me actually buying albums again. I had a few metal albums in the very early 90s when I started buying music. That was almost like a necessity to me at the time, because that was the only format it was available on, or they were cheap. I didn't like the way records sounded because I had a crappy record player and I thought they all sounded like shit. And again, you couldn't, this was not my format of choice at the time. It was CDs, but there was something appealing about the size of them, the artwork and everything. And this was really when I started building up a record collection in 96. And one record that was a very big deal to me at the time, Subhumans, Rats. Subhumans was probably the other band that I was obsessed with, to the level that I was obsessed with the Misfits that year. Picked up as much stuff as I could. I think I bought all the records that I had from Crypto Comics in Albany, who I've mentioned a bunch of times. It's actually Rats EP on one side and Time Flies But Airplanes Crash on the other. This one in particular I grabbed off the shelf to show, just because a lot of people are familiar with the EPs and everybody knows Day the Country Died. All their records are great, perfect. Lyrically, there was something that Dick Lucas carried across as far as criticizing the British government at the time and criticizing society at large. That was a lot more, I don't know, there was a certain personal slant to it that was very, at times, funny, but always intelligent, that bands like Crass and Conflict and a lot of that other stuff just didn't resonate with me, but Dick's approach to things did. He's a storyteller in a lot of ways. There's a song on here that's one of my favorite songs by them, Susan, that's, it's just... it's a heart-ripping, sad song about a girl that, graduates from school, gets a job, gets pregnant, just living in life and feeling that, like, that whole, like, sort of existential dread of just questioning her own existence, and then pretty much takes her life. And it's a beautiful song. It's just piano. There's no, like, loud guitars or anything. and it's really haunting. It's awesome. But this whole 12-inch is fantastic. I mean, the rest of the stuff is, you know, fast British punk, snotty, but that song kills me every single time. It's just such a bummer, but like so smart. Just a well-told story. Like I mentioned a few times, going through my record collection, there was the local record store, Oliver's, and around that time that year, 95 or 96, I don't remember exactly when, somebody from who worked at a bar around the corner, Hungry Charlie's, that was like kind of almost like a punk hangout for a while there, he or she flipped all of their record collection that was all old punk stuff, and myself and a bunch of my friends scored tons of stuff. And again, like, there was no way to get this stuff unless you were willing to travel to find a better record store. So when things like this happened, you leapt on it, you know. But I got the JFA full length. This is awesome skate punk, the original skate punk. You know, a lot of people, when you say skate punk, they rightfully so tend to think of NoFX and Fat Records stuff, or Bad Religion, Pennywise. But this was early 80s, kind of scrappy, kind of hardcore stuff with a bunch of surf influences thrown in. I think the singer, Jacob Brannon, was it Jacob Brannon? No, not Jacob Brannon. Brian Brannon? Something like that. The singer wrote for Thrasher, I know, at certain points, and was also a professional skater himself, or at least was in some skate videos that I had. So they were legit. But yeah, great. Short, fast, Pist hardcore with like a melodic surf edge. Great. And I used to listen to the Bouncing Souls a lot. And I'm not ashamed. Fucking great band. At least these first two records that were on BYO. This is The Good, the Bad, and the Argyle, their first, and then their second was Maniacal Laughter. They put out a couple records on Epitaph after that I never really got into that much. They're decent. But this is got a pretty serious East Coast punk vibe, melodic hardcore punk vibe that years later I figured out that they got kind of the melody style from Token Entry. This was actually put out by the singer from Token Entry too. You know, if you know your melodic punk, your Warped Tour, 90s Warped Tour kind of stuff, I'm sure you've heard these guys. But just fun fucking punk rock, you know, sort of hardcore, sort of punk, hardcore in the old way, if you will. Not taking itself seriously. They were a great band. I had a tape. I dubbed the first two off of this dude that I knew that was just hanging out in Syracuse and living there, was a dishwasher, and I played that tape to death. I guess he was friends with these guys, so I got it in on the ground floor and heard them before a lot of other people did. There was a bunch of other stuff I was into that I don't own anymore, don't really care to, like Anti-Flag and a bunch of other bands that I'm kind of bleh on now, but whenever I throw on Bouncing Souls, however infrequently it is, they always put a smile on my face. And I've shown this off before, but just to balance it out with the Bouncing Souls stuff, I guess. I got into... This was the first Discharge I owned, and I'd read about them being this legendary, influential band. I remember Anthrax covering Protest and Survive on Attack of the Killer Bees. You know, I'd always seen guys in Metallica wearing their shirts. You know, they were one of those bands, but again, if they didn't have anything being distributed through the stores in the mall, and since my local record store was pretty spotty unless people sold their collections with carrying stuff like this, because nobody was interested in it in my town, it was hard to find. So this was, you can see right there, the label, Oliver's Records, $5, and this is a fantastic live record. Sounds great, and it's got most of the hits on it: Protest to Survive, Drunk with Power, Blood Runs Red, Why, Too Monstrous, Nuclear Stockpiles, Decontrol, Never Again, Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing, Nightmare Continues, Realities of War, you name it. Vicious, groundbreaking hardcore punk from the UK. It's Discharge. So that was good to have, you know, and years later I found more and more of the actual records. I own most of their important stuff now. Another Oi band. Discovered this band via MRR, Maximum Rock and Roll. I had an interview with them back in the day. I bought this on CD when I was visiting Cincinnati. They had a great like punk record store, which I cannot remember the name of, in Cincinnati at the time on Vine Street, and it was run by this guy named Don. And I had absolutely nothing else going on when I was visiting there and hanging out with my aunt, so I just kind of hung out there all the time, hung out on the front steps. Got told to not stand around on the street by the cops a lot. But anyway, this is the one. I bought a bunch of stuff, but this is the only one I remember buying. And, you know, it's great, just very, very simple anthemic oi rock and roll kind of stuff from New Jersey. Just a bunch of working class dudes, like legit working class dudes, belting out a bunch of catchy choruses about working and drinking and, you know, everything that goes along with that, pretty much. But if you are curious about the whole street punk thing, or oi, American oi, there's a lot of great 90s American oi. These guys were at the top of the heap, I think, along with the Templars and a few others. Check out the Wretched Ones. Real simple, real stripped down, like most oi is. Just good punk rock, really. And I should mention, as I've talked about before on the channel, you know, I went through a couple of this period of 95, 96, beginning of 97, wasn't feeling metal, but it was one of those things where I kind of hid in my room and hoped people didn't notice. You know, I was my mohawk and my fucking devil lock and the whole ridiculous outfit. You know, if you were into that at the time, or at least where I lived, liking metal wasn't cool. You know, I hung out with metalheads. I had no problem with them. But I had this whole stupid punker, I hate metal attitude for like a little while. But I still enjoyed The Accused, who I got into from some of the older guys that I used to party with. And the year previous, I had been babysitting for this lady who, I won't go into lurid detail, but she didn't really need a babysitter. Pretty sure she was collecting some sort of public assistance. Her husband worked like a dog, and they had 2 kids. And she's like, hey, I'll pay you $50 a week to watch after my 2 kids for a couple of hours a day. I was like, all right, that's fine. I mean, she was a friend of mine at the time, not too much longer after that. But what happened was, one week she couldn't pay me, and her neighbor across the street, who was some kind of drug dealer, for one reason or another, it's kind of shady, I don't know, gave her a huge box of records, and it was all metal. And this was at like the lowest point of my interest in metal, but even then I kind of was like, records are kind of cool, you know, look at the artwork kind of thing. I was like, fuck it, I'll take them, you know. She's like, I can't give you your $50, here's a ton of vinyl. I might have even been a little cheesed off about that, but years later I still have most of them. Like Slayer South of Heaven was in there. I can't remember if this was or wasn't, but I bought it for one reason or another around the same time if it wasn't. Creator Endless Pain. Had a lot of Priest. Got Screaming for Vengeance there. Defenders of the Faith. And what was really sweet, right here, this cool Venom compilation, From Hell to the Unknown. If you haven't seen this, this is kind of falling apart, so I gotta be careful with it, but that huge upside down cross that it folds out onto, and you know, it's got, I think it's like the first 4 albums worth of stuff. There's some live stuff on here, there's a radio interview, but live version of Die Hard. That was cool to get for nothing. And I also got the Hell at Hammersmith live in '85, 12-inch there, Teacher's Pet, Poison, Witching Hour. And this was the beginning of me like throwing on these records late at night, you know, after having a couple beers or whatever, and kind of thinking like, wow, this is so sloppily played. It's almost like punk, you know. It has the same kind of energy as a lot of old hardcore punk stuff, because it wasn't airtight, you know, like a lot of the Scott Burns produced stuff that I was into. And that's kind of what set me back down the path of getting back into stuff like this, you know. It was only like a few years later that Celtic Frost finally clicked for me, you know, and early Voivod was a big one. When I was into crust punk, I heard like Roar and War and Pain, like when I was mostly into like very tight technical Florida death metal, and I hated it. I thought it sounded like complete garbage. But years later, when I was getting more into stuff like Amoebics and all kinds of crust stuff like that, those first two albums were perfect because they were so discharged, and I just didn't get that when I was younger. So that's the handful of metal records that started to kind of leak their way back in. I don't remember exactly what was up with the Creator, but I did have it, and I listened to it like friggin' crazy. So yeah, that is my story of 1996, as disjointed and mushmouth as humanly possible. I got to get back to work, folks, so I'll see you when I see you. Everybody, have a good week. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for commenting. Follow me on Instagram, Ground Zero Salem.